Hello and welcome to another lesson about language and social issues. In this lesson we're going to talk about code switching, which is something that we'll need to be able to have the vocabulary to describe over the next several weeks. Code switching is a word that is out there very much in the media. People talk about it. There's an NPR show called NPR Code Switch. But we're going to talk about it in a little more technical way than they usually talk about it in these shows. And so first, though, we have to talk about what code switching is. So code switching is basically switching codes. And what we mean when we talk about a code is a language or a language variety. So this is when you switch between two languages or when you switch between two language varieties. And today we're going to talk about how we code switch, how we in linguistics categorize different kinds of codes that you can switch between in a social situation, which code is which code, right? We're going to talk about why we would code switch in a given environment. And mostly I'm going to give you the vocabulary that you'll need to be able to talk about different instances of code switching between two different languages or language varieties. So let's say you and your friend are having a conversation in Spanish. And both of you speak both English and Spanish. You've just chosen today to speak to each other in Spanish. Now imagine that your friend comes up to you and that friend only speaks English, and you and your first friend know that this new friend only speaks English. If you're trying to be nice to that friend, or if you want to talk to them about something, include them in your conversation, you're probably going to stop speaking Spanish and in English. So what you've done here is you've changed your language so that this new person can join in your conversation. And this is called directive code switching. This is a type of code switching that you do to direct information at somebody who might not have otherwise understood the language you were speaking. So switching languages so someone can understand. And this type of directive code switching, to use a word from our previous lesson, is affiliative. It's a way of showing somebody we want you to be part of this interaction. Right? When you switch to include someone in your conversation, this is affiliative. Now there's another kind of directive code switching, which is disaffiliative. And that's, imagine that you've changed languages to speak with your new friend, and then they say something really mean, and you don't want to talk to them anymore. What are you going to do? You're going to turn back to your original bilingual friend. You're going to stop speaking English, turn back to your original friend, and start speaking Spanish again. So this has the effect of, this is changing languages so someone can't understand. And this has the effect of telling that person that you don't want to speak to them anymore. So that's disaffiliative. You're saying, I don't want to speak to you anymore. Now at the same time, this switch to Spanish will tell your bilingual friend, I still want to be your friend. Right, which is affiliative. So directive code switching has disaffiliative and affiliative effects depending on what languages everyone in the room speaks. Now I want to say one more thing about directive code switching before we move on, which is that usually directive code switching involves changing languages, because this is about making sure you're understood, technically understood, right? It doesn't involve changing language varieties. But there are some circumstances, like if you have a relative who's hard of hearing, and you speak loudly to that relative, or especially clearly to that relative, that is changing up your language variety to perform directive code switching so that they can understand. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next kind of code switching. All right, so there's another kind of code switching which we've already sort of started to address informally. And this is the kind of code switching that you get when one family has a home language and a school language, and those languages or language varieties aren't the same. It could be all different kinds of situations. We'll talk about this in a minute, but let's talk first about a home language and a school language situation. So this is a situation that we call diglossia, which is that there are certain languages that are appropriate in one setting and certain languages that are appropriate in another setting. And those designations of appropriateness might have to do with where you're going to encounter speakers who don't speak my language. So if your home language is Spanish, you're probably in the US, you're probably going to still speak English at school, and that's partly because there are people at school who don't speak Spanish. But it might also be that you're going to a school where everyone's bilingual at that school, but just because you're in sort of an American education system, you're supposed to be speaking English, right? So diglossia is something that can happen when everyone's bilingual. Also, an important thing to note about diglossia is that when we talk about diglossia, we're talking about the social situation that leads to certain languages being appropriate in certain situations. When we talk about the action of changing languages, when you go into a new situation, that's called situational code switching. So diglossia, in some settings, one language is appropriate. In other settings, another language is appropriate. When you go between those two settings, you do situational code switching. So let's go through some examples of what situational code switching might look like. So first, this is the home language, school language situation. A kid speaks Chindali at home and English at school. Even if all of the teachers at that school speak Chindali, someone has decided that in school we speak English. Here's another example of situational code switching. A kid speaks English everywhere except in French class, where they've been told we're learning French, so we're speaking only French. This is situational code switching as well. A mother speaks Av to her children, who she brought into work, and standard American English to her colleagues at work. So this is one physical location, but there are two different sort of social situations going on. One is sort of a parenting situation, and one is a work situation. And this mother is being expected to use standard American English at work because that's a work social situation. And the parenting situation, there's less expectation about which language she speaks, and she's going to choose Av. A rabbi uses English at home and in the community, and then Hebrew just for religious ceremonies. So this is even within the synagogue, they may be using other languages like English in the synagogue, but just for certain religious things, the rabbi is going to use Hebrew. And now everybody in that synagogue probably speaks English as well if it's happening in America, but you change to Hebrew for certain reasons, right? There is a social situation of religious texts and things like that, which calls for Hebrew. A politician uses Chicano English to address Chicano constituents, but switches to standard American English to deliver political addresses. So this one is actually one that we'll come back to as another kind of code switching as well, but this is certainly situational, right? So it's more acceptable as a politician to use a non-standard variety of English when you're just sort of speaking to individual people than it is when you're giving a political address. When you're giving a political address, you're supposed to use standard American English. So these are all situational code switching examples. Now, usually when you're doing situational code switching, this is happening sort of, you might do a paragraph in, a paragraph's worth of talking in one, and then you switch because the situation has switched. So these are sort of broad scale code switching. You switch and then you don't switch back right away. Let's talk about some of the kinds of code switching that happen much more quickly in conversation. So let's go back to that first conversation between between two English-Spanish bilinguals, right? So these people both have complete command over English and over Spanish. In their conversation, they might draw on both languages and switch back and forth constantly because both of them know the other one understands both languages. So switching constantly between English and Spanish because everybody understands everything and we can switch whenever we want. This is called conversational code switching, and it's switching codes within a single conversation without changing up the people in that conversation or the languages that people in that conversation speak. So we're not changing our situation, we're not directing at new speakers who maybe don't understand our language or disincluding speakers from the conversation. This is just switching codes because we can. So this sort of conversational code switching can take a lot of forms within the conversation. You can switch codes at the end of your turn at speaking. So for example, if the person before you was speaking in English, you might reply in Spanish, right? That's at an utterance boundary. That's what we call them. Just as easily, this can happen at the end of one speaker's sentence, right? So one speaker is just speaking. At the end of their sentence, they decide to change languages. So for example, speaking in Hindi and then speaking in English for the next sentence, right? This can also happen at phrase boundaries. So this is not the end of a sentence, but it's in the middle of one sentence, but it's sort of where you would put a comma or something like that. So here's an example of that. You can also get it just for individual words. This is a common sort of code switching where you just plop one word in another language. Now this is different. We talked earlier about borrowing words from other languages. This is a little bit different because oftentimes you'll actually get the phonology of the original language much more clearly in these cases of code switching. So if I were borrowing the word sobrina, I might be saying, last week my Sabrina came to visit, right? That is not really code switching. That's more like borrowing a word, right? But if you use the Spanish pronunciation of that word, it's more likely to be code switching. And you also sort of have to diagnose these based on how commonly used is that word in English, right? So if most speakers of English wouldn't know that word, it's probably code switching. One of the coolest things is that you can also get code switching within a word, right? So people can code switch just a part of a word. So for example, this example is my sister calpified the curry, where you can get just a piece of a word from another language. All right, so most conversational code switching happens within one situation. And in those situations, as we saw with situational code switching, you're likely to have an expected language, right? So the one that you're expected to use in that environment. So for example, Spanish is your home language, just because that's what the parents in the home decided is that we speak Spanish at home. Or maybe they only speak Spanish, right? So for whatever reason, Spanish is the language that you're expected to use at home. This expectation could be set up just by we started having this conversation in Spanish, right? Then Spanish is the expectation for the rest of the conversation, right? Or it could be set up by where we are, right? So for whatever reason, you have an expectation for which language is going to be used in this given conversation. Then you can switch to another language, and that extra language that you're switching to is going to be more noteworthy because it stands out. You're making a choice to switch to that language. The vocabulary that we use to describe this kind of a choice is that the basic expectation is called the unmarked choice. You don't notice it. If you're going to continue speaking Spanish, there's nobody making a choice to continue to speak Spanish, really. I mean, it doesn't seem like a choice, at least. Whereas if you switch to English, you're making a marked choice. So this is the marked language, right? You are making a choice to change things up. And so people will notice that, and they'll ask themselves, why did she switch to English, right? And that's going to mean that you can encode a message, a social message, in just the choice to change languages, right? So that choice to change languages can send a message. And the most common way that we describe this kind of choice to change a language within a bilingual situation as sending a message, we usually call this metaphorical code switching. And that's because the code switch sends a message, and the marked language acts like a metaphor for something sort of deeper that's going on in your interaction. The changing of the language tries to do something. So let's look at some examples of this. This will make it much clearer. So this first set of examples we're going to look at is one of the most common ways that people use this sort of metaphorical conversational code switching. So here's one example. A teacher switches to Japanese to speak to a Japanese-speaking student who's crying. So this little kid is sitting and crying in the corner, and the teacher happens to speak Japanese, and so changes to Japanese to help figure out why this student is upset. In this case, Japanese, the use of Japanese in this situation says, I'm like you. You can trust me, right? I'm a person who also speaks Japanese. I understand that your comfort language is Japanese. That's where you're most comfortable. And since you're uncomfortable in some way because you're crying, I'm going to speak to you in Japanese to make you feel more comfortable. This is a metaphor, right? So all that teacher might be saying in Japanese is, what's wrong? What's going on, right? That's not saying that much, right? But there's this extra layer of meaning because they've chosen to switch to Japanese instead of using standard English, for example. Here's another example. We saw sort of an example like this before. A politician switches to "av" when speaking to Black constituents. This is a way of saying that the switch to "av" instead of standard English says, I'm like you. I have a similar life experience. I have this knowledge of this language variety just like you do, right? This is a way of making connections. It's affiliative. It's showing people I'm like you. Similarly, kids in an immigrant household may choose to speak to one another in English rather than the home language. And this is interesting because it's saying we're the kids, we're the second generation immigrants or third generation immigrants, whatever it is, right? We're the kids who know this language that is used in the outside world, right? And so this says English, the use of English in this particular household says I'm like you, right? So this is a certain type of metaphorical code switching which relies on a set of codes being marked as a like you code and a not necessarily like you code. And the language that we use to describe this in linguistics is the we code, which is a language or language variety that identifies two people as being part of the same group, and a they code, which is a language that doesn't identify them as part of the same group. Using the we code with someone you're speaking to is affiliative. Using the they code with anybody that you're speaking to is typically disaffiliative. It might be just unmarked, depending on where you're at, but it's more likely to be disaffiliative. So let's look at a couple more examples of we and they code examples so we can talk about this sort of switch between we code and they code, because mostly we talked before about switching to the we code. Let's talk about some where you switch to the they code. All right, so let's say a kid uses Chicano English to speak with friends in the classroom. So we've already talked about how Chicano English is indicating that we're like each other. This is using the we code between the Chicano English speaking friends in the classroom. At the same time, it's sending another message, potentially, depending on who the teacher is. It potentially is sending another message to other students in the classroom who don't speak Chicano English or to the teacher. That we're not like the teacher, we're not like the standard English speaking world, right? So it's both affiliative between the kids who speak Chicano English and disaffiliative to everyone else who's in the classroom who doesn't speak Chicano English. So this is the we code for the Chicano English speaking kids, but it's you're switching to a they code for everybody who speaks standard English, right? So this is sending a sort of a double message. A child switches from Spanish to English to tell their mom to stop bugging them all the time. So imagine you're having a conversation in Spanish. Your mom says, you never go clean your room. Why don't you ever do the dishes? And you say in English, shut up, mom. Stop bugging me all the time, right? This is a way of using English as a marked choice in this situation. This is not the we code between you and your mom to say, I'm not like you, right? Or I'm not cool with how you're behaving right now, right? This is a disaffiliative use of English, a they code, to tell your mom to stop bugging you all the time. Here's another example. You and your friend are speaking in Spanish, but your friend says something irritating and you say, come on, in English, right? So this is a way of using English to say, I'm not cool with that. I'm disaffiliating from you. Our sort of secret code might be Spanish, but we both know English. I still am communicating with you. I'm just not cool with the way you're acting right now. So this is more examples of we and they code switches. Now there are other sorts of metaphorical code switches which don't just rely on this sort of I'm being affiliative or I'm being disaffiliative. So for example, other sorts of metaphorical code switches are often based on language ideologies. So this is the beliefs that you have about the speakers of one language variety, right? So you can switch to a language or a language variety in order to send a message. So let's start with a sort of a shocking example of this. A white kid who's not Latinx uses Chicano English when pretending to be a knife-wielding murderer, right? So this child has the language ideology that Chicano English is associated with murderers, right? And so is using Chicano English in this context to indicate that they are a murderer, right? And this has to do with language ideologies. A child in a Pashto-speaking home, this is a much kinder metaphorical code switch, but a child in a Pashto-speaking home switches to English when describing a project they're working on for school. This is just because if you have English as a school language, you're probably going to associate English with being academic or academically minded, right? So in this case, English stands for academic achievement, and so if you want to project yourself as being a high-achieving academic student, you're going to use English in this environment. Here's another example that's sort of halfway in between. This is based on language varieties. Your friend says the phrase farm country in a southern accent. And this could be because your friend believes that southern accents are associated with rural environments, right? So when they want to talk about rural environments, they switch to a southern accent because it invokes this sort of rural feeling in their mind, at least, right? So this is other sorts of metaphorical code switching. Like I said, you commonly get it, especially when people sort of switch for longer term pieces of a conversation. It'll be about we and they code stuff. But this kind of thing often comes in with short phrases. Switching between language varieties in particular is where you get this sort of language ideology metaphors in your code switching. All right, so we're drawing to the end of this. The last thing that I want to say about conversational code switching is that the use of conversational code switching at all does something to index who you are as a person. So for example, if you and your friend are able to conversationally code switch between Spanish and English, you're saying, we are both Latinx Americans who come from families that still use Spanish, and we have this similar identity of being able to fluently speak English and Spanish. Just the fact that you're using both those codes in one conversation is indicating something, right? Without even making reference to when you use each code, you are indicating something about your identity by doing it at all. Similarly, you could have conversational code switching between Arabic and English, which could show that you are an Arab American whose family still uses Arabic in everyday conversations, right? But just like any other kind of index, it can index different things for different people. So this code switching between Arabic and English, if you are a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, code switching between Arabic and English might say, I've been deployed in the Middle East, and so I have language skills that show that we've both been deployed in the Middle East, right? So this kind of conversational code switching is a way, just using it at all indicates something about your identity. All right, so that's the end of our class on code switching. I'm just going to go over what we talked about. So we talked about different types of code switching. We talked about situational code switching, which is changing language in situations of diglossia, where there's some languages appropriate in certain contexts and other languages appropriate in other contexts. We talked about directive code switching, which is changing languages to determine who understands you and who doesn't understand you. We talked about conversational code switching, which is changing languages within a single interaction, usually between people who can both understand both varieties, at least. You know, maybe don't both have equal command over both varieties, but you can at least understand each other even when you switch. And we talked about metaphorical code switching, which is more of a reason that you will code switch than it is a way of code switching, right? Changing languages to send a message, and often this does identity work, right? So, and we talked sort of about two kinds of metaphorical code switching. So there's the we code, they code switches, which is basically about affiliating yourself with somebody or disaffiliating yourself from someone, and usually, and that contrasts with a marked, with switching from an unmarked code to a marked code, which is the marked code tends to send the message, where an unmarked code is just the expectation, right? And then we talked about how you can use code switching to invoke language ideologies, right? So we talked about the examples where you can code switch so that you can invoke some identity thing that you associate with that language variety as well. All right, so that's code switching. I hope you are able to understand these examples, and we'll go through some more examples in our other classwork this week.